Please be seated.
I want to invite you tonight to open in your Old Testament to the book of Deuteronomy. If you have been keeping up with the reading schedule, I think it's this morning. I think that's when I read that. You begin this book. It kind of wraps up Numbers and starts the book of Deuteronomy in today's reading. And I thought we might just kind of give an overview of the book this evening. And I'll just go ahead and tell you. 34 chapters and however many minutes we're going to do this tonight, that's just not a lot of time. So we're going to move pretty quickly, and we're going to see whether or not I made a bad choice in deciding to do that. That's a possibility, I suppose. That's what we're going to try to do. The book of Deuteronomy is the last book in what we often refer to as the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the law. And we get that name, Deuteronomy, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. At one point in the book, in chapter 17 and verse 18, Moses is dealing with certain regulations and restrictions that pertain to Israel appointing a king over them. And he would say there in verse 18 of chapter 17, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests. And in the Septuagint translation, that phrase, this law, is the word Deuteronomion. It means literally this second law, or this repetition of the law. And so the law that was first given at Mount Sinai was restated just before the death of Moses as the Israelites were encamped on the plains of Moab. And the importance of the book of Deuteronomy can be seen in the frequency with which it's quoted in the New Testament. There are more than 80 different quotations, or at least allusions, to the book of Deuteronomy in the writings of the New Testament. For example, when Jesus was tempted by the devil, he responded each time with a quote from the book of Deuteronomy. When Jesus was asked about which commandment is the greatest commandment, he quoted from the book of Deuteronomy. And most of this book records different discourses of Moses, and the first discourse is dated to the 40th year after the Israelites left Egypt. So we're at the tail end of things. And more accurately, we read in chapter 1 and verse 3, it was the 40th year, the 11th month, and the first day of the month. When we get into the book of Joshua a little bit later, we're going to find that Israel crossed over the Jordan River into Canaan on the 41st year, the first month, and the 10th day. And so this first discourse of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy is less than 3 months, about 70 days before the Israelites begin to take the land of Canaan. Not much time between those two things. And when you consider the fact, we learn at the end of the book of Deuteronomy that the Israelites mourned for Moses for 30 days. He's not alive, so he's not, that's not when he gave these things, obviously. That leaves about a 40-day period in which Moses gives this instruction that we refer to as the book of Deuteronomy. And although I don't want us to spend a lot of time on this, I do at least want to point out that the geographical setting for the book of Deuteronomy, I don't know if you'll even be able to see this very well, is on the plains of Moab, just opposite of Jericho. You can see that's kind of where you have it, the Israelites coming up in the red on the right-hand side. And you got a little arrow. It's kind of pointing at Jericho there. And that's where they are before they cross over into the land. And that's where they are during this entire time that Moses is giving them these instructions in the book of Deuteronomy. It's near a place called Beth Peor. It's in a region we read in chapter 1 and verse 1 known as the Arabah. And so they're going to spend a good bit of time there receiving this instruction before they cross over into the land. And so after 40 years in the wilderness, the people of Israel, they had finally arrived at the border of the Promised Land. They had arrived at the southern border, 40 years earlier and didn't want to go in. But here they are on the eastern border. And what Moses does in the book of Deuteronomy is he prepares them to enter into the land. There are a number of things that made what we read in this book necessary for them. For one, a new generation had arisen by this point in time. Many of the people who heard Moses in the book of Deuteronomy were not even alive when the Israelites were at Mount Sinai. The oldest among them was a teenager at that point in time, except for Joshua and Caleb. And so that makes this, something that was necessary. If you recall, if you've been reading in the book of Numbers, back in Numbers chapter 14, the Israelites, they grumbled against God, and they basically said to him, it'd have been better if we died in Egypt. It'd been better if we died in the wilderness. And so God says to them in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 28, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing, I will do to you. You don't think it's better to die in the wilderness? Here it is. You're going to get it. Your bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and all of your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. And so that generation is gone at this point. And so not only do we have a new generation here, but this new generation is also about to face some new challenges. They're about to go into a land that is inhabited by people who were being judged by God for their absolute corruption. God had told Abraham that his descendants would live as sojourners in a land that was not their own. They're dwelling in Egypt. But he also had told him that they would come back to inherit the land of Canaan in the fourth generation. And the reason God didn't give it at the time of Abraham is because, as he said in Genesis 15 and verse 16, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And the implication is that by the time the Israelites came to inherit the land, their iniquity would be complete. And whatever else you might want to say about that, there would obviously be some dangers and some challenges of going in among a people who were that corrupt. And that's why God commanded the Israelites to completely wipe them out. It was his judgment upon them. And on top of all of that, a new leader was about to emerge in all of this. If you remember, Moses was not allowed to enter into the land of Canaan with the people of Israel. We read that back in Numbers chapter 20, when he struck the rock rather than speaking to it to bring forth water. And so Moses had been leading the people since the time they came out of Egypt, a period of more than 40 years at this point. And it was necessary to help the people make that transition to Joshua's leadership. And the book does deal with that transition some, especially towards the end. That was necessary for the people. If I had to summarize, though, the book of Deuteronomy, what I would say is that it's more than just a restatement of the law of Moses. It's not just a second law, so to speak. In this book, Moses was seeking to implant within the people of Israel the will to live by God's law. And this book highlights the necessity of obedience to the law of God. And the lesson of Deuteronomy is basically this, that obedience is essential. It is essential to health. It is essential to happiness. It is essential to heaven itself. But I do want to point out that the book of Deuteronomy doesn't encourage what we might call a mindless or a heartless kind of obedience, nor does it come from a heartless tyrant who's simply concerned about, impressing his will upon the people without, any concern for their well-being. And so in chapter 10 of this book, in verse 12, the Lord says, and now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers, and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are this day. Circumcise, therefore, the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Not a heartless kind of thing at all. It's very loving. And so when you read passages like this, it makes it all the more shocking what people like the scribes and the Pharisees in Jesus' day, what they did with the law of Moses. They seem to view it merely as here's a list of rules to obey. And they're kind of selective even in that. We pick this one, we throw that one out. But the law of Moses was much more than that. It's not just a law of, not just a list of rules to obey. And when you read through the book, what you see is that it actually excuse me, it actually opposes the legalism that eventually grew up around the law. And it will highlight just how far off people like the scribes and the Pharisees were in their views. And I believe it helps us make better sense of the conflicts that Jesus often had with those people. When we go through and you read what God intended for things to be and you look at what they had done with it, it helps us kind of put all that in its place. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses poured out his heart in urging Israel to be faithful to the Lord. And so this book contains 34 chapters. It contains 958 verses. It contains 28,461 words. And almost every verse in the book is filled with exhortation, instruction, warning, various promises. And so Deuteronomy is going to speak of the past to some degree, but not really just as we're going to record what happened in the past. When Moses deals with the past in this book, what he's going to do is he's going to remind his listeners of select events which would then be used as the basis for encouraging them and warning them at the present time. When Israel failed, don't be like that. Instead, be like this. And so although the book of Deuteronomy speaks of the past, it really focuses on the future, at least from that point in time. Yes, it looks back to Sinai, but it looks forward to the entrance to the promised land as well, and beyond that to the ultimate salvation of God's people. And one thing you'll notice about this book is that the laws it deals with are clearly meant for what is often referred to as the settlement period, for the period of time when Israel would occupy the land of Canaan. And the warnings of this book point to the dangers that they were going to face in the new land. And the ultimate goal of all of this was to ensure that the Israelites would enjoy a long and prosperous possession of the land that they were about to enter into. And so the book emphasizes the fact that God's covenant is offered anew to each generation, and that commitment is the key to experiencing the benefits of that covenant. And so in the first few verses of the book, we read, for example, in verse 3, that Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. And then in verse 5, Moses undertook to explain this law. So that's what we're going to find in this book. And like a master teacher, Moses was going to clarify and he was going to interpret the law that was received at Mount Sinai to ensure that the people understood it. And he spoke almost like a father who earnestly and lovingly admonishes his children. And one thing you find is that he set forth in no uncertain terms, again, the consequences of both obedience and disobedience. As I mentioned earlier, much of the material in this book was written in the form of discourses given by Moses to the people of Israel. And the truth is, we'd probably call them sermons. And that's really kind of what they are. And so Moses was doing more than giving the people instruction in these discourses. He was appealing to their motives and to their emotions. And these things were meant to move the people who heard them, and even to move people who would later read them, of course, in the pages of this book. And one of the interesting things about the book is that its structure is very similar to some of the treaties from the ancient world, what we would typically refer to as vassal treaties, where a powerful king would come in and there would be a people who would be subject to him, and he would enter into a treaty with them, and those treaties would generally follow a basic pattern. And we see that here. After an introduction in chapter 1 of the first 5 verses, there is a historical summary. It takes place most of chapter 1 all the way through chapter 4, where you get God's dealings with the people, the king's dealings with the people. And then you're going to have from chapter 5 through chapter 11 some general requirements. Here's the basics of the basis of our agreement, of our covenant together. In verses 12 through 26, there's going to be some specific requirements. Let's get down to the details of what this is going to look like. And then there are going to be in chapter 26 also, at the end of that chapter, the invoking of divine witnesses. We call God to witness of these things. And then in chapters 27 and 28, there's going to be what you call the pronouncement of blessings and curses. If you keep these things, there are going to be some good things are going to happen to you as a result of that. And if you don't keep these things, these general requirements and these specific requirements, if you don't keep them, then there are going to be some bad things that happen. And so that would have been something that people at that point would have been familiar with. It's, the Israelites were not to be like their neighbors in many ways, but the nation of Israel did come into existence at a particular time and place in the world, and God dealt with them in ways that, let's just be honest, seem kind of strange to us. We don't get all of that, but it would have been familiar to them. It would have even been familiar to the nations around them. You could have given the book of Deuteronomy to the Edomites, and they would have said, oh, here's a vassal treaty. That's what's going on here. They would have gotten that. And so the people from the nations around Israel would have understood what all of these things meant, just as the Israelites themselves would have understood it. And so when you look at the book of Deuteronomy, there are two fundamental truths that are taught. And the first of those is this: the God of Israel is unique. He is not like the gods of the nations around him. And so one of the it's been said that Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4 was the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Other translations, I think, capture the sense of that even better. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Or Yahweh our God, Yahweh is unique, another translation puts it. And again, that's probably the best known verse along those lines, but it's certainly not the only one, or even the first one in this book. So in chapter 4, in verse 35, to you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him. That's one thing that God is going to try to get across to the people of Israel in this book. But a second fundamental truth that we're going to see, or at least mention, we're not going to get to see a whole lot because we're not going to get talked about too many passages. But the second fundamental truth is that Israel was a unique people. In chapter 7, in verse 6, you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Or chapter 4 and verse 31, the Lord your God is a merciful God. Excuse me. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. Or chapter 6 and verses 22 and 23, the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. All through, God is unique, and Israel is also unique as his people. And so there was a unique relationship between God and the people of Israel. Israel had entered into a covenant, an agreement with God. And we even find that the book of Deuteronomy talks about God being their father. We're familiar with that concept in the New Testament, but it's found in the Old Testament as well. The people of Israel were not only to fear him, they were to love him. And so Deuteronomy 6 and verse 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Or Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 12, now Israel, what does the Lord require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to love him and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Those principles are found all throughout. And there's one principle that, again, you can't miss when you read this book. And that is that there is an obvious emphasis, again, on their obedience. One writer put it this way: the necessity of obedience is expressed in the law of God, the motive for obedience in the goodness of God, the standard of obedience is the word of God, the incentive to obedience is the faithfulness of God, and the alternative to obedience is the justice of God or the judgment of God. And you see all of those principles dealt with again and again in this book. Commentators kind of differ over just how many discourses of Moses are found in the book of Deuteronomy. It's kind of hard sometimes to figure where one begins and the other one ends and that sort of thing. They range from people who think, it's all just one discourse, to some who divide it up into as many as 10. And the truth is, I don't know how many different discourses there are in this book. It's hard for me to figure them out, and I'm not sure it really matters. I'm not sure it matters how many there are. It all goes together in one way or another. But there are, at the very least, a number of different sections in this book, and each of them have a slightly different purpose. And so the first section, or the first discourse of Moses, covers, again, the first 4 chapters. Following a brief introduction, the first 5 verses, Moses is going to bring to remembrance the history of Israel since leaving Egypt. And it's not an exhaustive history by any stretch of that period of time, but rather a carefully selected history. And the purpose of opening, the opening historical review is made clear in chapter 4. Israel had experienced both God's wrath and God's mercy. And Moses wanted the Israelites to learn from their past so that they could enter into the promised land and they could enjoy God's blessings. That's what chapter 4 of the book, excuse me, I'm sorry about that. That's what chapter 4 of the book is going to deal with. And so a new generation, a new leadership, and the prospect of a new land demanded a new application of the Sinai covenant. You guys need to not be like the past generation. The second discourse of Moses is going to be a little longer. It's going to go from about chapter 5 all the way to about through chapter 26. And one thing you find in chapter 5 is a restatement of the Ten Commandments. We're going to start with the basics in chapter 5. It serves as the basis of everything else in the law of Moses, just kind of like you see at Mount Sinai. God began by giving them that. In chapters 6 through 11, Moses is going to preach to the people. His chosen text, so to speak, is, again, Israel's history and the events that took place. With the exception of Mount Sinai, he's not going to mention the same things from the first 4 chapters. But just as in earlier chapters, he's going to appeal to the people to obey the covenant. And he's going to stress the need to avoid things like idolatry. And he's going to talk about the need for humility so that they don't fall into the same sins that the Israelites had been characterized by time and time and time again. Things that ended up with their fathers being destroyed. That's chapter 7 through 11. In chapter 12 through chapter 26, when you begin to read through that over the course of the next few days, what you're going to find is there's a lot of legal material. Several laws are going to be reformulated for the new situation in the land of Canaan. Moses is going to set forth laws about religion. You're going to only have one sanctuary. It's going to be the tabernacle. All idolaters are going to be cut off. There's going to be regulations about clean and unclean animals that are going to be enforced. There's going to be talk about the great feasts, the 3 feasts, the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Tabernacles. That's going to take up, chapter 12 through chapter 16. And there's going to be laws pertaining to political life that are going to come next. The authority of judges and priests are going to be set forth. And the procedure in courts of justice are going to be defined, and the laws about witnesses and cities of refuge, and here's how you go about making war. It's going to talk about all of those things in chapters 16 through 20. Laws respecting social and domestic relationships are going to come next. Moses is going to discuss crimes against society. He's going to discuss the family relationship with husbands and wives, what Jesus would have a discussion with Pharisees about in Matthew 19. What about Moses? What about what he commanded? And he would go to Deuteronomy chapter 24. There's going to be laws about how you treat people, how you treat your servants, what you do when you make vows, what happens when you trespass, how about charity, what about matters of individual character. All of those things are going to be found in chapters 21 through 26. And then the third address of Moses, which is chapters 27 and 28, is going to ultimately come down to, making provision for renewing the covenant in the promised land. And then you're going to have the people, in essence, commit to that. We're going to follow. We're going to do this. Here's how the law is going to be preserved, and we're going to make a perpetual memorial to remind us by placing great stones once we pass over the Jordan River as a reminder of this. And then Moses is going to say, all right, you've agreed. And now I want to talk to you about what happens if you follow through and the great things God will do for you if you do. And I want to remind you that if you don't follow through, he's going to bring great judgment upon you. And I tell you what, that is a sobering chapter to read, and we'll get to that as we go through the book in our reading plan in chapter 28. In the fourth address, these are going to be shorter as we go along. Moses is again going to call for renewal of commitment. You need to be committed, people. In chapters 29 and 30, that's going to be the focus. In these chapters, Moses is going to give his last exhortations to obey the Lord. The last that he is going to give while he is upon the earth is going to come in chapters 29 and 30. In chapters 31 through 34, they basically are just kind of an appendix to the book of Deuteronomy. In chapter 31, Moses is going to quit preaching, and he's going to start doing things in chapter 31. For example, he's going to write down what he has been saying to the Israelites. In chapter 31 and verse 9, Moses wrote this law, and he gave it to the priest, the son of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And he's also going to establish a routine for reading the law, for going back and being confronted with it again. And so we see that in chapter 31 as well. In verse 10, Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones, and the sojourner within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law. We're not just going to be told these things in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is not just going to write them down, but he's going to come up with a plan for the Israelites being confronted with it at least periodically. Chapter 31 ends with an introduction to what is sometimes referred to as the Song of Moses, in which Moses taught the people as a testimony against their future disobedience. And the song itself is found in chapter 32, and what it does is it contrasts the faithfulness of God on the one hand with the faithlessness of Israel on the other. And in this poem, which is basically what it is, Moses offers kind of a prophetic interpretation of history which encompassed the past. Here's what happened in the past, what's happening at the present for them, what's going to happen in the future. And the song itself is interesting because it addresses not the contemporaries of Moses primarily, but it's going to be aimed at the future disobedient generations, which would provoke God's wrath in the promised land. Of course, that all came to pass. You just read the Old Testament and you find that. In chapter 33, we're going to read about the blessing of Moses. And in this chapter, there are no exhortations and there are no warnings. All that kind of stuff has come to an end. And Moses instead is going to invoke God's blessing upon his people for the future. And again, the perspective is prophetic. Moses is speaking as a prophet, and he surveys the future of the people of God. And that poem begins with the fact that the kingdom of God has been founded. God reigns, and it concludes with a reference to Yahweh himself as the ultimate and the eternal refuge of his people, in whom they can rest, a redeemed people who have a blessed future. And God's purposes will prevail in spite of the behavior of one or the other generation of people who leave the Lord. And so it is a remarkable picture of who God is. Despite the fact that they would turn from him, he would bring them back and he would bless them. And then the final chapter of Deuteronomy is going to narrate the death of Moses. It's going to bring out the leadership of Joshua, the changing of the guard, so to speak. And as I mentioned earlier, it wouldn't be long after that. When you come to the end of these things, which took place again over a period of about 40 days, it wouldn't be long before Joshua would lead the people into the promised land. They're on the verge. You even get an account there in chapter 34 of Moses getting to go up the mountain and to look into the land. But he doesn't get to go. He doesn't get to go. But the people will. And they needed what he provided here at the end. I think that's remarkable. Moses didn't look at this and say, you know what? Because of you, I'm not going to get to go. Because of you, I'm not going to enter into the promised land. Instead, what he did is, you're going to. And you need to know some things, and you need to remember some things. You need to learn the lessons of the past, and you need to be committed to God so you don't repeat those problems. You need to be the people God called you out of Egypt to be, because you are going to enter the land. What an attitude he had. What a great attitude he had. I'm not going to enter in, but I want you to, and I want you to succeed in doing so. And that's what Moses left the people of Israel with in just the last month or a little more than a month of his life upon this earth. It's a great book. You know, it's one of those sections of Scripture where we read through and a lot of times we're looking at it like, what's in it for us? And when it comes to the details of some of those laws, there's not a lot in it for us, you know. But there are some principles that we can learn from what is found in the book of Deuteronomy. And it certainly lays a foundation for much of what we read about, not just in the rest of the Old Testament, but as a background for what we see in the New. And in the book of Deuteronomy, you know, tonight we don't learn about, you know, what must I do to be saved? That's not a question the book of Deuteronomy is going to be able to answer for us. The law of Moses doesn't answer that for us. But it leads up to the coming of Jesus into this world where that question is answered, where a prophet like Moses arises and who takes the same kind of concern for his people that Moses did, who instructs and who wants what's best for them. And what we want you to understand tonight is that we live under that different covenant, where Jesus serves as our mediator, where he is the great lawgiver, where he has commanded things that are for our good, and who has called us to obedience as well. That principle has never changed. And so if you're here tonight and you've never obeyed the gospel of Christ, that's what you need to do. You need to humbly submit to the one who loved you enough to send his son into the world. And you need to obey him, to obey the King. And if we can help you tonight to do that, we ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.
Oh, Father.